Hey there. Welcome to The Climate Cycle, a podcast focused on Canada's climate tech ecosystem. In each episode, we sit down with founders building climate solutions right here in Canada to better understand the challenges presented by climate change and what we can do about it. In today's episode, we sit down with Wayne McIntyre, the founder and CEO of Relocalize. Relocalize is eliminating middle-mile logistics with hyperlocal food production. Transporting food produces about 3 gigatons of CO2 every year, and while electrifying transport will play a huge role in reducing those emissions, Wayne and the Relocalize team asked, what if instead of electrifying all of these links in the chain, we eliminated them entirely? Relocalize is on a mission to deploy microfactories at distribution centers, producing food and drink near the point of consumption. Starting with packaged ice, they're challenging the centralized production model that's been dogma for ages, where we're essentially trucking water across the country despite it being widely available and eliminating the emissions from that middle mile transportation. In my conversation with Wayne, we explore the inefficiencies and high carbon costs embedded in our current food system, why now is the right time to challenge the centralized production model, and get into the weeds on unit economics and automation versus autonomous production. Wayne also shares his perspective on identifying climate opportunities within existing systems, creating a culture of healthy conflict, and the need for patient capital in Canada. Let's get into it. Wayne, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for the invite, Justin. Looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, glad you could join us. So I'd love to start off. You have a really interesting background. You've held senior positions in a number of different industries, including a few in aviation. I would love to hear just a bit about your background and your journey to working on Relocalize.
Absolutely. I guess I've been in tech for 20 some odd years now, so it's been a while, and really across different sectors. So biotech, hard tech, aviation, aerospace and defense, CRM software. I've kind of been all over the place, and I have a general love for tech. I'm always curious. And over the years, those professional interests have remained a bit separate from some of my personal interests and passions, in particular around sustainability, around environmentalism and decarbonization. And really the journey here for me has been, take all that learning from all these different industries and all these experiences and find an opportunity to bridge my personal passion for sustainability with my professional experience. And really that's what gave birth to Relocalize. I spent a number of months, well, really, if we really go all the way back years, looking for an opportunity where we could have a good business and have an impact for the planet that's sustainable and scalable. And that gave birth to Relocalize.
Fantastic. And where did that passion for sustainability and nature and all of that come from? And how does that show up in your day-to-day?
My happy place is as far from human beings in the village as I can be. I've paddled upriver and downriver from Lake Superior to Hudson Bay, 2,000 kilometers in the middle of nowhere on hikes. This has always been my personal passion, and I've been, I've been carbon negative since before we really, I think, got behind the climate change initiative altogether, I think, over the last 5 years or so. And so this has always been something that's mattered to me. And it really comes back to my love of nature, my love of the outdoors, my love of plants, animals, and ultimately a passion for ecology and biology as well.
Very cool. Yeah, a lot of that resonates as well. Spending a lot of time out in nature and family camping trips and hiking and all of that. I think it really creates a deep appreciation for the natural world. And yeah, I feel like a lot of people start from that place. So tell me a bit about Relocalize. How did you come across this opportunity, and kind of what's the climate problem that Relocalize is tackling?
Well, so I've spent a lot of my career building business model designs and trying to build business models. And so I actually came at this initially from a vertical farming perspective. My concept was, what if we were to co-locate production with distribution? decentralize, in this case, the growing of produce in that way so that we could eliminate the trucks between the point of production and the point of distribution. That's called the middle mile. It's one of the dirtiest and most carbon intensive parts of our food system. And, when I dug into the vertical farming sector, my challenge was, how do I make the unit economics work? And one of the big barriers to making small scale vertical farms, or we don't know, I guess vertical farming or any type of technology enabled agriculture work is really scale and throughput. And, if you invest a whole lot of money in robots and technology, but you can only push out 100 or 500 units a week, it's pretty hard to get a return on your investment.
Right.
And, I struggled with making decentralized vertical farming work as a business model. I guess a few years later, it looks like, that was probably I'm not the only one who struggled with that. A lot of companies, I think, haven't had the benefit of internalizing those externalities. So as a result, it's hard to make the numbers work. Today, I believe it will work eventually. And, just in my mentoring activities, I stumbled across a guy who had built a better mousetrap for making ice, completely patented, lower energy, lower waste manufacturing system. That took me down a path of trying to understand manufactured foods and their particular unit economics. And that's when I discovered that actually manufactured foods, in particular food and beverage products made of water, just have this sweet spot for unit economics where, hey, we can do something amazing for the environment and actually have a win-win for retailers where they get sustainability and cost reduction at the same time.
Interesting. What is it about those types of products that you found really works?
So if you think about a large centralized production plant, there's CapEx, there's buildings, there's people, there's machines, all the usual stuff. And it really became, I think, dogma that central is always better. Central is always more efficient. And, in recent years, the cost of transportation have gone up so much and, the carbon associated with them, people actually care about it, that suddenly there are, for a handful of products, I think already opportunities where, that cost of that middle mile transportation journey is actually the most expensive part of the cost of goods sold for those products. And so if you can find a better way to do that and a local way to do that, you can actually get rid of those trucks, eliminate that cost line. But you have to find a way to do that efficiently, of course, because there are things you gain and things you lose when you decentralize. There are jobs that are harder. And really timing was important because we're at a point right now where the cost of robotics and automation have come down so much that finally that equation kind of works. Not for every product. I think in the future it will work for more products, but it will work for products that are expensive to ship and have a relatively simple input supply chain. That's a place where this model can really work.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you're starting with ice, which checks all of those boxes. It's essentially water. The fact that we're trucking ice around, water is available almost everywhere. It is kind of mind-boggling that that's the way we've decided to build at least this type of system.
For packaged ice and beverage, it's just insane to be putting water on trucks when it comes out of every tap in every building in North America and in much of the world. Yeah, it's really it's a crazy notion, but we've all gotten used to it because centralization is the only way, right? So, if you're a major, and I won't name any names, but if you're a major CPG branded beverage, and you're in Canada, you maybe have 3 or 4 bottling plants for the whole country. And then everything has to go on a truck from there, right? And actually from the perspective of these big CPGs, that's already, 3 too many. It would be best if it was just 1 from a control perspective. But from a carbon perspective, it's really a disaster. And I think this is where, electrified transportation can make a big difference. Right. It can really, and I think it's important that we fix that link in the food chains. But if you could make that link go away, that's even better. And I think the challenge, at least for the foreseeable future for the electric semi option, is it's not cheaper. It's better, but it's not cheaper, right? And really getting consumers to switch and getting to scale in terms of impact means there has to be a huge appetite at the mass market level, right, for what you're doing. And I think as long as you're increasing costs in today's environment, and as long as externalities like carbon emissions are not internalized and don't have a cost to producers, well, unfortunately, you need to find those places where it's a win-win for everybody, right?
For sure. Yeah. I would imagine the labor side of that is a
Mm-hmm.
big challenge for these middle mile logistics companies and distributors finding
Mm-hmm.
enough drivers to actually move things around and have a reliable system.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Every time you open up a website or a trade press thing for the logistics and trucking industry, it's trucker shortage, trucker shortage, trucker shortage, trucker
Mm,
shortage year after year, right? And that's a big driver for the cost increase for certain.
right, right. So I'd love to maybe dive into the weeds a little bit
Mhm.
on the kind of micro factories. Could you share a bit more about how they actually work, kind of where they're located? Are they behind a grocery store? Are they at distribution centers? What does that kind of look like in the field?
So our version of hyperlocal production is co-location with distribution, right?
Okay.
There are solutions that are at the store level, and those solutions are relatively low volume and often difficult to support for packaged food, anyways, because again, you're dealing with a low throughput scenario again. If your store is only selling 5 or 10,000 units a year, how many robots can you afford to put into that store, right?
Mm,
So really for us, hyperlocal means at the point of distribution. So that means you're serving, say, 100 stores or 150 stores. That gives you enough volume that you can throw some serious capital, some serious technology at those microfactories without compromising unit economics, at least in today's environment. And I think this is what's really new. And so what's a microfactory? Microfactory for us is the same thing as a full-scale factory. It does, production, package forming, packaging, logistics, all the aspects that you'd expect to see in a full large actually facility, but actually has to do more things too because there are no people there. That's how you make it efficient. If you're decentralizing your labor as well as your capital, you're going to have a problem from a unit economics perspective as well. So actually the factory we have down in Florida, Jacksonville, Florida, is in fact the world's first autonomous factory for the food and beverage industry. And the autonomy portion of our technology stack is critically important because that's how we actually deliver the efficiency. And so again, come back. So it's at a DC. We're basically vertically integrating everything upstream of retail, right? We're vertically and we're partnering with that retailer very deeply. So they actually are moving up the value chain as well in partnership with us. They take control of their supply chain. They take control of their carbon emissions in their supply chain and their scope 3 emissions. They're taking control of supply chain risk. And they're getting some economic benefits as well and sharing in the upside of this new model.
right, right. That's super interesting. I'd love to know a little bit about some of these conversations you're having with customers, whether it's that location in Florida or other potential customers. What aspects of this solution do you find are particularly resonating with customers?
Well, if you're a retailer, you just came through COVID, trucker shortages. We're still looking at, global bottlenecks for supply chain and supply chain resilience. These are all top of minds if you're a CEO of a grocery or convenience store retailer. And so when somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, how about we give you a dedicated source of supply? How about we decarbonize? How about we reduce costs?" And we're not talking about half of a percent or a fraction of a percent, but 10, 20, 30% cost reduction in operations, cost
Wow.
on shelf. And we do this for a product category that matters to you. And in the southern US, there have been a whole lot of supply chain challenges for ice. Ice is critically important, believe it or not.
Hmm.
To be honest, I didn't know this when I started out either. So, I mean, most of us don't realize that, it's an essential service down in Florida, Texas, California, in these hot climates, especially during hurricane season. It's really a critically important product. And if you're a convenience store retailer and somebody comes in for ice in Georgia and it's not there, it's not the loss of a sale, it's a loss of long-term customer value. And this is where sometimes as an entrepreneur, you need to be prepared for the unexpected. I never would
Yeah.
have expected, to be honest, I'd end up in ice. But here's a place that matters much more than I thought. It's the most expensive and most complicated product to ship. There's a high level of waste and it comes with all these other challenges. Suddenly you realize, wow, it's these fortuitous events that sometimes allow you to build a business because when that opportunity comes knocking, you're ready to answer because you've been listening, but sometimes it's not where you'd expect it to come from, right?
Yeah, that's so interesting that ice is that important in that market. That's such an
Mhm.
interesting discovery and having those customer conversations and hearing these things emerge. So I'd love to know a little bit more about, this decentralization versus centralization. From your perspective, what has really changed to make now the right time for decentralization? And I think it's kind of been a conversation more in, let's say, like natural foods or regenerative agriculture and some of those communities, talking about local
Mhm.
food and all of that, but it hasn't kind of made its way to the large scale food systems. So yeah, we'd just love to learn more about why now and kind of what's changed that makes this work now.
Well, for us, the big change has been really the cost of automation and robotics today. It's
Mm,
really become, go back 10 years and you need a pretty strong business case to justify automating a full factory
right.
from A to Z. And this is something that's now possible. But also, I believe the time is right from a retailer and partner perspective as well. Supply chain constraints have
Mm,
created new opportunities. Awareness of sustainability and the importance of decarbonization has reached new levels. But also, customers are increasingly asking for it, right? And unfortunately, there's no signal yet from the market that they're really willing to pay more, at least at the mass market level.
right.
Mass market is where impact happens. Premium is not a place where you can change the world, right? Only a fraction of people can afford it. But at the mass market level, there's definitely a desire. And, that's where, I believe right now, any product that's expensive from a logistics and manufacturing perspective, comes with these inherent disadvantages when centralized versus decentralized is the place to start. There aren't a ton of them yet,
Hmm.
but again, increasingly the costs of automation come down, and as of course the cost of energy and the cost of emitting goes up, more and more products become something that would fit within that model over time.
Gotcha. That makes sense. On the cost of automation, so is the automated production system, is that something that you developed in house? How do you see that cost curve changing over time?
What's critical for us is we're developing where things are novel, right? We're
Okay.
developing where there's a gap. And so, when we're talking, unfortunately, food automation is well behind automation in other sectors,
Mm,
fortunately and unfortunately. What it means for us is that, we can rely on some great suppliers like ABB Robotics for articulated robots. There are a ton of companies that make great robots. We don't need or want to make a robot,
right,
right?
right.
We actually would like to make as little as we can. Currently, what we do is we're taking the articulated robots, we're taking existing systems, and we've got some great suppliers for things like packaging and thermoforming technology, and then we're building around them to take them from a system that is typically, there's a human being there to recover them when things go wrong. There's a human being there to run those systems. That's just the way factories work today because there are people there. And basically, we put a layer around them from a hardware and software perspective that allows all of these systems to become truly autonomous. And then
Ah,
ultimately, our vision is thousands of these factories around North America. And then how do you manage a network of distributed production? You've got obviously that on the edge, you've got the micro factory unit of one, but ultimately, it's what we're building is a production network that brings a whole other level of optimization and opportunity from a software and industrial Internet of Things perspective. There's a ton of existing technology, but a lot of newer technology is required. So it's a lot of lifting, to be honest.
I bet. Yeah. It's super exciting though to see, a glimpse of that in the future. When you were getting into this space and even, being in it now, what do you think people tend to get wrong about this space? And I'm sure there's like lots of different angles you could come at this with, but yeah, any like common misconceptions or even, when you've been sharing the solution with customers or investors that maybe it's an outmoded preconception or something like that.
I think that when we're talking and pitching what we're doing, I think there's a belief that we're farther along than we are from an automation and technology perspective sometimes, right?
Okay.
So, if you say, oh, autonomous factory, sometimes people will say, yeah, yeah, of course, autonomous, it's automated. It's like, no, no, take a step back. Where are we on that spectrum from automation to autonomy? And in most manufacturing environments, we're right at the beginning of automated. not autonomy. And I think that's, we hear so much about autonomous vehicles. We hear so much about autonomy today and AI, that I do believe that sometimes people believe we're much farther than where we really are. In the automotive sector, it's come a long way. And
Okay.
you can go to China and take a fully autonomous taxi. You can do that in California right now too. But when you talk about manufacturing and advanced manufacturing, autonomy is not something that's actually happening out there in the world right now. So I think the amount of effort, the amount of development, the amount of R&D that's involved to actually achieve autonomy is really quite extensive. And maybe we even underestimated it a little bit at the beginning, even though we've got the benefit of having a very seasoned CTO who's kind of been there and done there in the automotive industry. That leap to autonomy is, I think, much higher and much more precarious than many people realize.
Interesting. Can you say more about the distinction between those two and kind of what those enablers are? Because I think I understand it on the surface level, but yeah, I would love to learn more about the distinction between those two levels.
So if you think about, for example, a cobot, right? So what happens? So you've got an operation, a small factory. You buy a palletizing cobot. It really makes you more efficient now because you were palletizing manually. Now it's automated. But that robot is working hand in hand with a human being. Right?
Okay. Yeah.
When you think about a conventional factory with a packaging machine, these factories are optimized for maximum throughput, not maximum autonomy. And with good reason, because you know what? If something happens and there's whatever, if you think about it, you use a photocopier as an analogy. When there's a jam and there's somebody there who knows how to remove the jam, well, let's not worry about jams. Let's worry about maximum throughput, right? And that's the whole premise of centralization. When you move to decentralization, you're prioritizing that jammed piece of paper in the photocopier, right? Because if there's no one there to clear it, the photocopier is now bricked.
Right. Yeah.
And I think this is where, developing for decentralization and developing for autonomy is quite different, because while automation makes people more efficient, processes more efficient, and operations more efficient, it's still not, taking you to the point of removing the human beings, at least on premise, from the loop. Because we're not actually about eliminating all the human beings. We're actually about, a bit like a UAV, we're flying those micro factories from a centralized command and control center. It's not that there aren't people there to support them and run them, but they're doing it from hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. And that's what's new and different when you talk about autonomy.
Gotcha. So it sounds like there's a large component of, being able to remotely monitor, but also is there an aspect of remotely intervening and doing that kind of diagnostic and troubleshooting as well?
Absolutely. So it doesn't matter which robot you're talking about. When a robot crashes, so it's not running anymore, they can only be recovered by a human being on site. So this is, in every manufacturing operation in North America, and hopefully somebody will put a comment in here and prove me wrong somewhere. But,
right.
Based on the more important experience of our CTO, but also mine, that ability to recover is something you just don't need. It's not that people couldn't do it; it's they don't need to do it. And I think that's where you go to distributed autonomous production, suddenly you need to do things that nobody else needed to do. The downside is you now have to build those the solutions and the solutions to those needs and problems. The good side is that becomes intellectual property. But
absolutely, yeah, building in those gaps. That's super cool. I'm glad you could unpack that, because I think that's something that's maybe not immediately evident, but is a game changer in terms of like the difference between those levels. You mentioned too, so you're starting with ice. You mentioned some other products that are, water-based and things like that. How do you think about the ideal kind of product profile? And are there types of products that, we're not going to get into because it just doesn't fit the model?
Absolutely. We're trying to create a bit of a movement here too, right? I'm hoping this business model invites other companies to come and compete with us or
Right.
cooperate with us, or to just go off on their own with new ideas that are in different segments than what we're doing, because ultimately this is a purpose-driven organization. And so the recipe really is quite simple, and happy to share it with everyone, which is first, pick a place where being decentralized comes with an advantage. And so if you're thinking about trucking, that means either you're inefficient from a logistics perspective. So that means either, let's say you've got a low weight, high volume product, which means you can't put many units on a truck, or you're extremely heavy and you're not using all the volume. That's another way that you're being inefficient when you're trucking, by being heavy, but per unit. So now the truck might be only 1/3 full from a volume perspective, but it's maximized on a weight perspective, right? So
Right.
what are products where it's inefficient in logistics? Then what are products where you have a relatively simple input supply chain? Because if you solve a downstream supply chain problem by creating a new upstream supply chain problem, you're
Right.
not really going to deliver economic results. So that would be a product that's very simple. Let's say, very few ingredients. Maybe it's a powder that you're turning into a baked product by combining it with water. Maybe it's a liquid that you're combining with a concentrate or a blended powder to make an energy paste. Whatever it might be, I think it needs to have a relatively simple input supply chain. So you have a really light connection from your input supply chain to the microfactory, but then what goes out is either high volume or high weight. And you're adding that volume, or you're, the air to that popcorn, or the water to that beverage happens right before you deliver directly to the customer or directly to the store.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. You seem to have a knack for kind of breaking down these complex systems and supply
Mm-hmm.
chains. I'm curious for other would-be founders that are going into existing systems. I think is a very important area of climate that is very intimidating. It's easier to kind of build a standalone thing. You don't have to interact with an existing system and try to reinvent a part of it or disrupt a part of it. Do you have any advice for folks that may be looking at an existing industry and how to break that down and kind of make sense of it and identify some of these opportunities?
A good question. My thinking on how to approach it is first we've got, take the foods chain. You've got all these chains and links. So it's easy to start a company where or not easy, but it's easier to start a company. It's all relative, right? Where
Yeah.
you're maybe just tackling one link, right? So you're not changing the whole system, but you're changing that link. And hopefully the interfaces with the two connecting links on either side of the link you're working on are really simple. So you're not adding a lot of change to what other people are doing. That's one place to focus. Another place to focus is a little bit like what we were doing, is take a blank sheet of paper, all right, and say, okay, instead of a chain, we're actually going to have no chain. And actually everything that happens in that chain goes away and is replaced by us. We do all those jobs.
Mm.
Because we're doing all the jobs, we can do them however we like. We're not constrained by, oh, no, you can't, load a pallet this way into a truck because that's this limitation, or, our palletizing robot can't handle that, or it doesn't matter, because we control everything up to the point that we interface with the customer. So I think whether you're going to go for all right, we're going to change the world by, let's say, electrifying the middle mile transportation link, or, hey, we're going to think about the whole system and try to get rid of the chain completely. Both of those scenarios involve interfaces with your
Mm.
customer and your client. Those interfaces have to be seamless. And so for our example, what's happening upstream from the retailer is like nothing that's ever happened before from a food production perspective or food and beverage world. But when they come to unload it, they unload it like they would a truck. So that
Oh,
interface
right.
between us and the customer changes nothing in their operations. Actually, it just changes good things. It's like, oh, we only
Right.
need to come get it when we need it. We don't need to unload a truck. We don't need to store it in our warehouse. We don't need to refrigerate it. They don't mind when those things change.
Hmm.
Oh, we only have to touch it once instead of touching it 4 times. That kind of change is good. But in terms of how they operate, you drive up a forklift and you unload it. So for them, the only differences are positives, and the change management is easier. I think that's really, when you're approaching a problem, make sure that interface isn't asking too much of the system you're trying to change, but be bold and brave about how extensive a change you're willing to make, as long as you can control it and deliver at that interface point for your customer.
Gotcha. It kind of narrows what you need to focus on of simplifying that interface. It's kind of like, from the software world, an API, like making sure
Absolutely.
those API endpoints are super clear, documented, simple, exactly standardized, what's expected, rather than, hey, everything's kind of a roll your own and you have to do this. And
Yeah,
yeah.
ideally, you use the exact same mentality. That API mentality was like, can I see your existing API? Oh yeah, don't worry, we're just going to plug into that. And it just so happens that the protocol interface in this case might be human beings, or might be a loader, might be a truck, whatever it might be. You just need to make sure that you take that same approach.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It sounds like, as we've been talking, that the founding team and your team is an important role. How did the team kind of come about, and how did you, pull the team together?
Well, we took a bit of a different approach than many startups. I think there's a few of us in here that are long in the tooth. That comes
Right.
with advantages and disadvantages. I think from dealing with CXOs, experience in deal making, experience in automation. I think that ability to interface and change a whole system and work within it, I think benefits from the experience. The flip side is you need people who are coming with fresh ideas and completely out of the box thinking, and that's where we have that marriage between food tech entrepreneurs, people from the startup world, people from the industrial world working together in collaboration, and it's a really healthy tension. Where it's like, hey, I want to recreate everything, and then no, we can't recreate this.
Right.
And why would we want to? Because our customer doesn't want us to. Where that interface between, I think that those years of experience and intimate knowledge of the system that we're breaking and rebuilding, combined with completely fresh, out of the box thinking, and that doesn't necessarily always mean youth and age.
Yeah.
When we're talking about these things, but in our case, it has, it means we have a real spectrum of, really brilliant young engineers all the way to guys who are, starting to lose their hair, and everything in between, and men and women who just come from all different
Yeah.
experience levels through the organization, through an organization, and through an industry, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome. I can definitely see the benefit of having some of those conversations with executives, particularly when you're working with industries that maybe aren't as like used to innovation or changing things up, and just like knowing how that works and knowing the culture that you're walking into in some of the organizations that you're working with.
And culture becomes critically important, right? Because how do you make that work? Because, and I think the way you make it work is by encouraging good conflict.
Hmm.
Canadians don't like conflict sometimes, and we have that certainly that stereotype. And we have to encourage conflict, lots of conflict, but good conflict, right? And that's how you get the best out of all these different stakeholder groups and experience levels and mindsets, and that's how you get that diversity of perspective, but you get taken advantage of it. And it's not
Hmm.
always easy, right? It's easy. It's difficult to put a diverse group of people together, diverse ways of thinking, and have them function effectively. And for me, it all comes down to building a culture where good conflict is not just accepted, but is actually encouraged.
How do you go about doing that? Like because it makes a lot of sense to have that free flow of ideas and the
Mhm.
psychological safety and all of that. I guess both, because it sounds like both within your company and in the organizations that you're working with.
Mhm. I mean, people need to learn to separate personal and professional to some extent, and it doesn't always come right away. It
Mm,
takes some coaching, it takes some experience, it takes some trust building, and you said psychological safety. I think that's where when you get comfortable with good conflict, you don't feel attacked. You know what I mean?
right.
We're banned. We might be attacking some ideas sometimes, but it's never personal. And I think if a high performing team has to be able to learn that. And I think you need to have a certain level of brain plasticity and willingness to try new things and think differently. But in our organization, if you need to be right, if you can't be wrong, and your ego is is such that, you need to be put on a tower and listen to at all times, it's definitely not the place for you to work, because here everybody's ideas are challenged. Doesn't matter if you're the co-founder, the CEO, the CTO, the robotics technician, everybody's invited to participate in leadership, because leadership is a team activity, not an individual activity at Relocalize.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think probably most people can think of a work environment where that has not been the case, and you have those people and cultures that also encourage that kind of grandstanding or ego or whatever it may be. So yeah, it's really cool to hear that that's the culture that you're kind of fostering there. You mentioned a couple of times that you're looking to build a movement, and I would love to hear more about, on the level of Relocalize, what your goals are for the next 1 to 2 years, but also what's the long-term vision that you're trying to kind of mobilize.
So for us, in the short term, it's quite simple. We need to get our technology to a level where it's reached high throughput, the unit economics are working, and then we can start to scale in ICE, right? And what does scale mean? And that means, by 2026, we're deploying 100 to 200 a year, right? At that level, we are disrupting an industry, the packaged ice industry. But what we're also doing is proving that it's possible. And from that platform of strength, that's already a point where, there's a path for a company like Relocalize to have over $1 billion in revenue, I believe, relatively quickly with the right partners and the right scale strategy, just in packaged ice. And from that position of strength, hopefully others look at that model and they build on it. And of course, we plan to build on it as well and enter other product categories that have similar kind of approach. But what we really see is, a world where whenever possible, your food is made locally, whether it's manufactured or fresh, right? It's a one-stop journey for food. It goes from the place it's made to the customer on an electrified delivery vehicle, ideally, or to the store. So a one-step journey for food. And ultimately, you go through a store aisle, and instead of it just being a few items that come from a local source, and we celebrate that, you're walking through the aisles and 30, 40, 50% of the products on those shelves were made in the local community where you live. That's really our vision. And what does that mean? That also means, from a decarbonization perspective, that we're tackling that 3.1 gigatons of carbon equivalent emissions that come from the supply chain side of our food system.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I guess, you kind of touched on that big picture is the 30, 40% where it's all coming from near your local community.
But for us, we see an army of robots, thousands of them, essentially taking on the incumbents and really changing the game. And, I think there'll be a power shift away from CPG and towards retailers in that world, right? Because it's their infrastructure we're piggybacking on. It's those local relationships that start to matter. And it really, I think, puts more power in the hands of retailers, which is something that gets, your retail consumer pretty excited.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Would love to get your experience on building a hard tech company in Canada, and specifically, what parts you've seen working well in the ecosystem, and then what's been harder than anticipated, or something that you see as maybe a barrier in the ecosystem.
The challenge of hard tech is all that hard stuff, right? It takes a long time to build. Product development cycles are much longer. And the challenge, of course, then becomes capital. And capital needs to be patient. Capital needs to be willing to have a vision, right? And that capital can't be relying on like a playbook of ARR metrics, and because ultimately each one of these business opportunities is going to look unique, and it's going to take some time, right? And I think that's something that there are, when you look at scale, investors who are willing to do that, including some in Canada, including some of our investors. But there are not that many of them, especially because we're 10% of the size of our neighbors to the south. And we're a bit more conservative and cautious. So, it's comforting to have a playbook to follow. It's comforting to say, well, show me these metrics that I know everybody else is using too. When you look at a company like Relocalize, you have to be willing to say, there is no playbook for this company.
Yeah,
right? We're willing to lead. We're willing to develop essentially go through a due diligence process and a market understanding process where you have to lead. and you can't just follow a herd. And that's often a tough thing to do for an investor, frankly, because it's much easier to do what's safe. It's much easier to LPs, hey, everybody's investing in generative AI. It's much
Yeah.
easier to get those LPs to give you their money when all their friends are investing in the same thing. It's a big challenge, and I really applaud those investors that are able to lead and are willing to do that, because it's not easy for them. They're also in a hard world, and we need more of them. We need more of those investors like that in Canada in particular.
Yeah, yeah, and to be able to step away from a playbook and dive in deep. And I know there's some efforts. I know there's some efforts like Climate Brick that are trying to democratize and kind of increase the transparency around new types of business models that aren't, your typical
Mm-hmm.
SaaS model. And I think efforts like that can be really helpful. And hopefully, with more success stories like Relocalize, these different types of models become a bit more familiar and a bit more accepted, and people can wrap their heads around it.
And big risks come with big returns too, right? And
Exactly.
if the goal is to have a big impact from an environmental as well as a commercial perspective, hard tech is a great place to be.
Absolutely. I'd love to get your thoughts on what would you like to see change in the ecosystem, or do you think would really support more climate technology startups?
Well, it's been in the news quite a bit recently, capital gains.
Oh yeah.
And I don't want to get into the debate over whether it should or should not be 75%. But I do truly believe there are certain targeted places where we need to encourage more risk capital, and maybe 0% capital gains is inclusion is appropriate for sectors where we're actually going to deliver not just economic value for Canada, but also global environmental impact. I think we need to get those incentives right. And when we talk about, say, capital gains, I think one way to do that is to ensure that we're creating conditions where private capital can support companies like ours and the many other companies who are leading in difficult sectors. And in addition to that, continuing to have organizations like Sustainability Development Technology Canada, who are willing to then provide an amplification, kind of 3x or 4x or at least 2x what you're able to do from these brave private investors, really makes a huge impact for a company like ours.
Awesome. Cool. We're just about covered all the questions that I have. Is there anything we didn't touch on that you think we should talk about?
Oh, I think the only thing I'd put out there is there's a ton of opportunity in hard tech. I think particularly around decarbonization and sustainability. I really think there's an opportunity for Canada to lead here with the right government support and the right private capital support. And we just need to get comfortable with a little more risk, and we need more risk takers to jump in with 2 feet and really imagine a different world for our food, and a different world for building materials, a different world for all the different advanced manufacturing and other hard tech sectors where we can really, I believe, make a huge impact on our carbon footprint and the future for my children and all of everybody else's as well.
Love that. Well, I want to just wrap up with a really quick rapid fire.
Mm-hmm.
So, number one, what's a piece of advice you would give to someone who's looking to make the jump into climate, whether as a founder or just wants to dedicate their career to this?
Just do it, but don't be afraid to don't be afraid to work within an imperfect system. Perfect is the enemy of good.
Love it. Do you have a favorite newsletter, podcast, or book that you'd recommend to folks?
Maybe some recency bias, but I'm rereading the Isaac Asimov books. In 1941, he imagined space-based solar, beaming energy back to Earth with microwaves. It wasn't until 1952 that the first solar panel was invented. So I think Isaac Asimov is always a great place to look for inspiration.
Love that. I actually haven't read anything by him. Do you have a title you would suggest starting with?
Yeah, I would start with Caves of Steel. But even before that, I, Robot and some of his short stories.
Awesome. And then what are you really excited about right now?
For us, it's really about the business. I live and breathe and our business right now. It's where the purpose and passion is. We're building that new piece of machinery that's really going to prove that the model works. So I'm just excited to deploy that. It's coming in the next 9 months, and excited to be making this vision a reality right now.
Cool. Well, Wayne, thanks so much for your time. This was a fantastic conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Justin. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed today's episode, leave a rating and a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It would mean a lot and helps grow the show. To stay in the loop on Canadian climate tech news, recent fundraising, job postings, events, and more, subscribe to the Climate Tech Canada newsletter on our website. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.